It's Good Friday, but have you ever wondered, why do we call Good Friday good? What's so good about a day when an innocent man was executed? What's so good about a day when somebody was nailed to a cross for something that they hadn't done wrong? The events of that first Easter, of that first Good Friday, are earth-shattering. It starts early in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning as the day begins. Jesus is on trial, and he stands trial between two of the ruling governors of the time, between Pilate and Herod, and they pass him from pillar to post because none of them can actually find anything wrong in Jesus. None of them can find any fault with what he's done. But the crowd are vehement against him. They want Jesus to be crucified. They think Jesus has blasphemed. He said that he is God, and Jesus had said that. Is that blasphemy? Well, I suppose it is blasphemy if he isn't God. But if he is God, has Jesus done any wrong? Anyway, Pilate and Herod are trying to find out a reason. Should we execute this guy or should we let him go free? But the crowd keep chanting, the crowd keep cheering, the crowd keep saying, crucify him, crucify him. So eventually they relent. They whip him and they beat him to within an inch of his life. They place a crown of thorns on his head, press it into his skull so the thorns penetrate his skin. And then they give Jesus this big, heavy wooden cross and ask him to carry it up the hill to his place of execution. His back is open, where it's been ripped open from the beating that he has endured. He's barely alive, and he carries this cross through the streets, people lining the sides, jeering at him, humiliating him, spitting at him, hitting him, and beating him. And Jesus takes step after step after step. And it almost becomes too much for him at some point. He loses his energy and he can't carry his cross. And the soldiers grab somebody else and they put the cross onto him and they command him to carry Jesus' cross for him. And they get to the place of execution. It's called Golgotha, the place of the skull. And they strip Jesus completely naked. And they lie him down on this cross. And they take big, massive, rusty nails. Not nails with a nice sharp point, blunt nails. And they place it in his wrist, between his bones, not in his palms, in his wrists. And they strike it with a hammer a few times and it goes all the way through his arm into the wood behind. And they do the same on the other side. The agony would have been unreal. They then take a massive spike and they place that spike through Jesus' shins, through one shin, out the back, into the other shin, and into the wood behind. And then they take the cross and they lift it up and drop it into a hole in the ground. And as they do that, all of Jesus' weight would resist against the nails in his arms and the spike in his shins. His skin would literally rip as he is lowered into that hole. And then he's left there. Crucifixion is a brutal form of execution. You don't die from the wounds here, you die from asphyxiation, you die by suffocation. You're in this position and you can't breathe, and the only way that you can breathe is by pulling up on the nails in your wrists and pushing up against the spike through your legs. And Jesus would have to do that, pull himself up and push against that spike to take a breath and then release himself down again. And as Jesus was crucified, he was at this height. He wasn't feet or meters in the air. He was at eye level. And the crowds would have been around him. And they jeered him. And they humiliated him. And they spat in his face. And they abused him. And all of this happened because Jesus has done no wrong. All of this happened because Jesus was willing to do this, that Jesus was nailed to the cross for those very people who were abusing him and humiliating him. And this was an earth-shattering event. For hours, Jesus hung on the cross, and Luke records for us something amazing that happens. It said at midday, the sun stopped shining. For 3 hours, darkness covered the entire land. It's not at the same time of year as an eclipse. It's at the season of the festival of Passover, which works in the moon cycles. We know this isn't an eclipse that happened here. Such was the events of this day that the sun itself stopped shining. And Jesus hung on this cross. Darkness covered the land. And then eventually we're told that Jesus gave up his spirit. He breathed his last. And at that very moment, the curtain in the temple was torn from top to bottom. You know, something that happens on the other side of the city at the very time that Jesus gives up his spirit, the very time that Jesus dies. What's significant about that? Well, this is where the good thing comes in. The very reason why Jesus is hanging on that cross, the very reason why Jesus is enduring that pain and that humiliation is for you and me. It's to do with this thing called sin, that rebellion against God, that thing when we do the things that we want to do and we ignore the things that we're pretty sure God would want us to do. Now, the curtain in the temple separated this thing called the most holy place from the rest of the temple. The most holy place was where God's Spirit was said to dwell. It was an impossible barrier. You couldn't go beyond that most holy place. Only the high priest on one day of the year, the Day of Atonement, could enter into that place. And even then, he'd have to go through a whole bunch of religious ceremony in order to stand in the presence of God. The Holy of Holies was the place where God's Spirit was said to be contained. But as Jesus was crucified and as he gave up his spirit, that curtain was ripped from top to bottom. And the symbol is clear. The way is open for mankind, for humankind, to go in and be with God, to meet with God. But God is also free to come out. No longer is God contained to a small piece of real estate in Jerusalem. God can come and meet with us and be with us wherever we are and whoever we are. We can't quite fully understand or fathom the events of that very first Good Friday. We still struggle to understand how can this be good. But as Jesus hung on that cross and gave up his spirit, he did so that you and me may have an opportunity to experience life, fullness of life, everlasting life. The end isn't here. It's just the beginning. And as we will see in a few days' time, on that glorious Easter morning, Jesus comes back to life. He's conquered the power of death and he's opened up the way for us to do so too.